Okay. It's a real pleasure today to introduce Professor Gary Bennett, who's an associate professor of psychology, global health, and medicine at Duke University, where he directs the Duke Obesity Prevention Program, co-directs the Duke Center on Biobehavioral Health Disparities Research, and is affiliated with the Duke Cancer Institute and the Duke Center for Health Policy and Inequalities Research. He got his undergraduate degree at Morehouse, then his doctoral training in clinical health psychology at Duke University, and then did a postdoc in social epidemiology at Harvard School of Public Health. He has a really fascinating background. I've worked in the industry for a while, so really understands both perspectives, both the commercial perspective and the academic one. He actually owned a company, Crimson Health Solutions, that sold to Health Dialogue, and he is funded now by the NIH as well as Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I want to let him get started because he's got a lot to say.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here today. You probably should not start a talk this way, but I'll say it anyway. Our conversation this morning was so interesting and touched on so many topics related to disseminating, commercializing health interventions. If at any point it would be helpful for me to go off slides and talk about any positions in greater detail, just don't hesitate to bring me and let me know. Don't be worried about the screen. It's just my attempt to be creative. We're going to be talking about eHealth dissemination science. Let's get the outset that a bit of what I do is actually in the area of designing efficacy for predominantly obesity in a range of socioeconomic disadvantaged populations. As I'll describe in a little bit, my interest in dissemination has taken off because of some of the challenges that I and other investigators have experienced innovations outside of our lab. But I like to think about eHealth and start talking about eHealth by going back to 2000, which was the first time that the term health in scientific literature. And I think it's important, this is a rapidly developing field, and it's important to kind of get a sense of how far we've come in the last decade or so. So back in 2000, you had Mark Zuckerberg, and he was a high school student, if you can imagine that. And he's made good over the last decade or so. And as many of you know, the creator of Facebook. And Facebook has grown, and if you had to size Facebook, you'd have to fit it somewhere between the US and India. It's 1 billion users, and those numbers are probably just a bit outdated, and they just made a fair bit of money last year. When you went back to 2000, you always knew when somebody was on a cell phone. There was no debate about cell phones. And now, back in 2000, the word texting wasn't invented yet. Texting, it didn't have that kind of suffix at the end, the ing. But now we have people who actually have motor vehicle accidents because they're texting as they walk through crosswalks. And some very interesting interface folks have started to design signs to warn people against walking and texting, which is a new problem. Back in 2000, President Clinton was president for a few minutes. And some of you may know that he had the distinction of being the first president to use email. He sent 2 emails in his presidency. Fast forward to present, and we've got a president who carries around an iPad. My favorite example of how far we've come, though, is back in the year 2000, kids would read their books on their potty, and today we have a device that allows them to read an iPad. A lot has changed in the past decade, and eHealth is really central, I think, to the development of the IT sector, at least in the last couple of years. This term eHealth is, I think, synonymous with digital health and overlapping in some ways with mHealth. Suffice it to say, there have been lots of definitions. This is the one that I like the most. Basically, it's the use of our emerging information technologies to improve healthcare. And at this point, we have eHealth interventions for a wide range of clinical conditions. Some of those you see here. And there have been a wide range of different types of interventions tested in the literature. I would say there isn't a whole lot of evidence for any one of these, but nevertheless, there is emerging evidence for all of them. And rather than go through all of the data in this area, I will simply say, and you'll have to trust me, that eHealth works. eHealth works, and we'll get into this, but works, the term works and the notion of evidence has a very kind of, really I think has a very specific meaning in our world. And by works in this case, I mean we see the production of clinically meaningful outcomes. We see whether it works to save money, whether it works to engage patients, those kinds of outcomes that others are interested in, I think remains to be seen. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Some important caveats about this literature, I would say, though, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is that we see the largest outcomes in trials where eHealth innovations are paired with human support. Some of you may question then, the utility of an eHealth device that has to be paired with an in-person kind of a coaching support for it to work very well. And in fact, this has been one of the challenges, I think, in the uptake in broader industry for this kind of innovation. We find that in large group, there is more than expected need involved. We see high attrition, and so when you don't have the accountability of working directly with users, we find that people stop using at times that they don't want to do. And we see this kind of characteristic decrease in engagement. People, you get an app, you sign up for it, you start using your app, you're tracking your calories and the whole thing, and then you stop using it again. So we see these are major. The last one particularly is a major problem for industry, and it's one that I'll argue that folks in our respective fields are uniquely well positioned to address. So as I mentioned, I run a group at Duke where we're interested in developing digital health solutions for primarily for weight loss and obesity prevention, and we work almost exclusively in socioeconomically disadvantaged audiences. When I would talk about this not so long ago, people used to say, what about the digital divide? Do those people use technology? And I'll say, and we won't talk about this today, but the populations with whom I work most frequently, socioeconomically disadvantaged racial minorities, some new data suggests that they actually are more likely than racial minorities, more likely than whites to use both own this, but also to use the advanced data. And we see this in our own work. We've done a number of RCTs, some listed here, to try to identify ways of delivering evidence-based interventions to these populations through these devices. But in this work, I think, like most of us, I do a lot of, I've spent time in industry, and I spend a lot of time at industry and meetings. And I think one of the observations I have as a scientist in this kind of interactions is that this field is growing. It's growing in ways that I think very few of us could have. And in fact, it's kind of growing in parallel streams. You have folks like me who do work designing what I think of as cool new efficacy trials on those wide range of populations, as you mentioned, mostly in primary care. So we do a lot of work integrating our tools with HRs and those kinds of things. And so we're sort of moving along. And then you have industry and industry like speed. And they're moving in ways that are hard to predict, hard for us to try to match. Bonnie and I were both at this and I had one of the more interactions I've had in a long time. I gave a talk, and after the talk, a CEO came up to me and said, we've got this really amazing about it. He was really excited about it. And he said, did you happen to see, this other real down here in the exhibition hall? I said, yeah, it looked really fantastic, and it seems like a great platform. He said, yeah, I thought so too. So over the lunch break, we were sitting down together, and we figured out the designer. We redesigned our app to integrate new innovation. We're going to fix that later on. And I just thought, for me to do that in the context of the grant, it would take about 5 years, several $1 million. And this guy basically knocked it out in his lunch break. And that's the speed with which the field of mHealth and health is moving. And it sort of it responds to different types of interactions, different currency. And I think a major question for us in the field is where do we fit? What's our value add? What's our value add in the market? And so I have been spending a lot of time in the last year and a half or so trying to think about this challenge. How do we get evidence-based intervention into the marketplace, into the hands of people? How do we do that most efficiently? Because as I argue, we have a dissemination problem. And one of my favorite quotes was that Francis Collins, head of the NIH, most recently at the eHealth Summit, said this, and I thought that this was going to hit like a, I thought this was going to be very in a very problematic way by my industry colleagues. And in fact, I think they recognize this, that there really is very little evidence in the commercial e-health space right now. And that presents major challenges. And again, it challenges us to figure out where we fit best. So the first way, in just in sort of thinking about this us having a dissemination problem, let me first say that the commercial e-health market is very crowded. We have tools that will allow you to hook up a glucose measuring device to your car. This will be coming out later on from Ford. We have not one, not two, but 3 network-connected toothbrushes that aim to both tell you and your friends how often you're brushing your teeth. We have this new board, which is CES a few weeks ago, that will help you to slow down if you're eating too quickly and start to vibrate. And there are already companies that have integrated this into calorie tracking apps. We have, I remember not so long ago, 10 years ago or so, when we tried to measure physical activity, we would take accelerometers and strap them to people's wrists with hospital bracelets so they could take them off. I was at the Apple Store the other day, literally a line of people trying to get the Nike Field device, which is basically the same thing. There are accelerometers in all manner of devices, including iPods and phones, and just a very short amount of time, a whole cottage industry has emerged just to help measure and promote their physical activity. There are almost 1,000 apps, about 700 weight loss apps on the iOS, Apple iTunes store right now. And weight loss apps are the most popular health and medicine app. And I should say that health and medicine apps are only about 2 to 3% higher population, but nevertheless, the volume here is unbelievable. So to get to the top 5 of most downloaded apps on the App Store, you have to, this figure here shows that you have to download about 17 times a day. So the top 5 weight loss apps are downloaded 2,000 times a day. And that is a real challenge because there's very little evidence today. We've had really download weight loss apps alone since 2007. We don't know any of these. That's a major challenge. I think that there's a paper that came out last year in Bonnie's Journal of Medicine, which showed, I thought, sort of for the first time, Bretton and colleagues, they reviewed 200 of these weight loss apps. They collated a list of 13 evidence-based principles and then reviewed the apps to see how many of these principles they included. And what you find is that no app had all of these kinds of principles. Only 10% had more than 6. But if you asked me as an researcher, what's the most important recommendation I'd make to our patients just to basically protect their safety? I would tell you that the recommendation that they not lose more than 1 to 2 pounds is critical, and you see only 60% of that apps have. So the lack of evidence in the commercial e-health market, I think, is a real challenge. It has implications that are far more. Some of you may have heard that the NHS has recently decided that patient engagement strategy, they were going to essentially allow their GPs to prescribe apps, and they have collated a list of 500 apps that they committed to a crowdsourcing process, and they are making these widely available. If you asked me how was evidence to crowdsourcing process, I would tell you that it was on the list, but it's crowdsourced, so who's doing the selection? Never, so suffice it to say, I've worked, Bonnie and I were talking earlier, I've talked with health plans people in this direction. Many in industry, this is a cost-saving measure. Again, I'd argue that the lack of evidence is not just kind of a quirky scientific problem, but it's one that has real implications potentially for our patients. But the challenge for us is that this space moves very, very rapidly. There are over 200 million in iPhones sold since 2007. There are over 1 million apps on the Onyx One App Store. March 7th, 2012, that a guy in southern China downloaded an app 25 million times. 40% of teenagers have iPhones. So things are moving very, very rapidly, and yet there are only about 20 randomized trials of apps for health. So I'd argue that this is not just a problem for us. Again, it's not just a problem, but nevertheless, our failure to discussion, demonstrating evidence, we've really missed, I think, one of the largest consumer technology revolutions in history. If you asked me how long it would have taken, if I knew the iPhone was coming in 2007, kind of nerd, so I did. If you asked me how I would have been able to get, whether I would have been able to get an R01 day one, if I had, in order to establish the efficacy of an app, I would have had a major challenge. If I'd known that the app was coming, I wanted to put in an R01 to measure the efficacy of the I would have gone through 1 or 2 cycles that may have taken 2008. Then hopefully I would have gotten it. I do weight loss research wrong, so that's about 4 or 5 years for a trial. So I would really only just now be getting that, and that assumes that I started on. And so of our funding processes of our field with respect to time. The fact that I'm publishing a trial outcomes today that was collected in 2006. Makes it really difficult for us to, and again, I think that should make us question, where do we really add value? Where are we best served? The market that's moving much more quickly than onto. Some of you who have thought about dissemination, this is an unknown concept, let me know, and I'll spend more time on it. You've heard about this kind of pipeline. Generally, we start to design and work our way through scale-up to sustainability, and along the way, efficacy and the like. And some folks have heard about how long this takes for the average intervention, but let's say it's around 17 years. Let's say it's within 5 years of that. It's very long. In industry, I think, and what we're seeing in the e-health market right now is the industry advantage is that they get to skip some of the fun parts. They get to skip the demonstrations of efficacy and effectiveness and sustainability. And so it winds up that this usually takes a whole lot less than 17 years. So it's challenging because we have constraints in our field that just make it difficult for us to do well. Things are starting to change. I would say if you look at the commercial e-health market, we started out in what I think of as kind of a generation 1, and that was 2007 to 2009. The first sets of apps were being released. There was really no evidence. What we're starting to see now, I think, to use a bit of a Bennett services task force kind of term, is insufficient evidence. I think what we see all over the web is that there are a variety of apps that like evidence, but it's insufficient. It wouldn't pass muster for us. This is an app, MyNet Diary, and what you see here is that of the users that met their selection criteria, which remain the same, over about 7, about 12 weight, and that would be, of course, we have no idea how these trials were conducted. This is put on their website, and I think that this is these groups are thinking about evidence, but they're thinking about it in ways that I think are a little bit problematic. If you look down at the bottom, what you see is that the free plan do the pro plan, the maximum plan. Those are the ones who really lose the weight. So we're sort of in this period where we have this kind of insufficient evidence. Where I think we're moving, and what I'm starting to hear is moving into a period where there's evidence-based apps. So these are apps that are that incorporate evidence-based principles built on evidence-based findings. What I'm starting to hear, and more frequently, is that I'm getting calls from venture capital groups all over the country who are resistant to make investments in new evidence apps unless there's some demonstration. And so what they're comfortable with right now is that if a group comes to and they base an app, or they base a system this intervention. Most venture capitalists are pretty comfortable. We're starting to see a lot of those types of companies come forward. Just recently released was an app called Bennett, and it is a 16 plus program based on the diabetes prevention program. So for those of you who know this, basically taking this gold standard weight loss intervention and one mentioned reduced incidence of type 2 diabetes in patients that were pre-diabetic. And this is actually a very wonderfully designed program that's built on it's really built quite closely onto the DPP. And yet, I can tell you the DPP was not done online, and it wasn't done self-monitoring electronically. And so we don't necessarily have evidence for this particular app, but nevertheless, it was built on one intervention. Where I think what I'd like us to go is to research testing apps. So are there ways more frequently for us to be working with testing the apps that are on there, testing apps as they are released in order to try to demonstrate their efficacy? And some of you may know that the FDA has started to get involved in this space, and the FDA has recently rules their preliminary documentation of the rules that they'll eventually use to regulate and help apps. They have a variety of categories. The most important thing to know about that is that most of these consumer apps, the ones that you can download, will not be subject to any regulation. Depending on politics, that may be a bad thing. The lack of discussion of evidence, I think, has allowed a culture to emerge about this. And I think, again, I think the challenge is for us to figure out how to kind of a situation where we're frequently thinking about how to work with industry to test these things. So the question I've been struggling with is how do we accelerate eHealth dissemination science? For those of you who are not in this space, you know, there's been a lot of interest in dissemination in the last several years. I think this work wrapped up in this space, wrapped up in this. You know, really efforts to try to think about how we ever get those into our lives and into our patients. Specifically in the health space, though, I think, as I've just mentioned, we have a number of challenges. One of the places where I think we may want to start is in this area. So increasing engagement, I view, as absolutely central to the conduct of health dissemination research. And the reason is that engagement is critical to adoption and consideration for many folks. We happen to know that you know, the kinds of metrics that we look at and to sort of characterize them are the same exact metrics that many folks in our potential adopters to the market also look at. So things like campaign participation, who people sign up, are people using it, how many people are using it, how many clicks are being issued in it. This kinds of data are of interest to a broad range of adopters in the market. We also happen to know that it's probably the most reliable predictor for intervention. These are data from one of our studies, weight loss intervention, weight loss intervention. Patients use the website, and what you see is what you've seen study after study. That makes it. And so as you move to quartile 1, which is a low level of loss, quartile 4, which is the highest level of people's weight loss, moves upward. Very, very classic finding. So this is an area where we derive a lot of value of the outcomes, but also where industry is quite focused. But sustaining engagement is a real challenge. For any of you who've done this kind of work, getting the patients online, getting them to use these tools for anything like a reasonable amount of time, is a Herculean challenge. And yet, I'd argue from some of the data I've seen industry apps, we do a far better job than my commercial colleagues. And it's because I think we're often using theoretical principles and behavioral science principles that can help. Let me just give you a little example of one of the challenges that I think we've experienced and how I think we can move forward. So this is a website from the study that I just showed you a minute ago. Well, I often say this study was designed and this website was designed in 2006, so do not hold the design against it. But you can see that it had, this website was very comprehensive, a lot of stuff. Now, like many of my colleagues, we really thought much stuff was going to be on this website. At the time, you know, there were lots of websites coming on board. And we had this kind of a challenge to kind of trying to sort through. Do we develop a website that does effectively what we want our patients to do, which is to self-monitor diet, all the other stuff we have? Or do we develop a very comprehensive website that has all of this other food skills training, talks about resources, includes recipes, and those kinds of things? And we decided, as most of us do, behavioral scientists do, we decided to adopt the kitchen. We created a very comprehensive website. And let me show you why we were told. So what you see here are page visits, either unique page visits over 24 months. And purple shaded region is self-monitoring. Visits to the self-monitoring. So what we ask patients to do is at least once a day, but at least once a week, but hopefully every day. Please go on to the website, track the data, tell us how well you've been doing with diet, and what you see here is reasonably consistent data, although it did decline over time. Patients logged on and they track their diet and physical activity. But that is everything else. So pretty much all of it was to use our self-monitoring interface. And you know, this may be viewed as a problem. I felt kind of good about this because I was in the camp of just designing a very clean self-monitoring based website. But nevertheless, what I want to illustrate here is this would never ever happen. This is not something. These are not. Because as soon as my industry colleagues would have gotten to this group, and they would have seen that nobody was using any of the other stuff that they would have directed all of their energy to trying to figure out how to get things. But I'm constrained by the randomized controlled trial, which means that my site is done the day that I randomize my patients. And as a consequence of that, I actually think these are amazing. I did this work with both sides. We didn't respond to feedback user behaviors industry. And so as a consequence, I can't necessarily expect anything. But I think one of the things that we realize in dissemination science is that there's some serious limitations in conceptualizing development. You really get your data when you see it. So that didn't stop us, though. We threw a whole lot at our participants. We gave them all of these health moms, tailored feedback, all the kind of things which are expected to. But I really call them some first-generation strategies. Again, these are the kinds of things that when you make a priority that you're going to want to patients want. These aren't the things that you do to be responsive to low levels of engagement. But we know what to do to be responsive to low levels of engagement. One of the things we can do is we can offer our patients services. And so, so one of the things that we've started to do as we are doing this kind of work is to try to mimic our research-based design, what we see in live commercial. So when most of us are designing apps for a whole range of health conditions, we may do it on a computer, or we may make a web app, or an iPhone app. We may make a cell phone or text messaging-based app, or we may do something like interactive voice response. But often the way that we do this in science, in scientific world, design is kind of like we either cross, or we do a cross app, or we'll do interactive voice response. But in fact, the way that most of us live our lives is that we don't really think. We don't think very much about the channel. We interact with multiple channels. And in fact, if you were to use Facebook, I see exactly the same intervention, the same Facebook intervention, whether I'm looking at it through the web, through a mobile app, through text messaging, or through a mobile app. And Facebook knows that this is a way of trying to increase your engagement. If I can, my students in class are Facebooking away as I'm talking, they get up and they walk out the hallway, up on the web. It's a way of ensuring that patients stay engaged, participants stay engaged. So I don't know of a trial that's really looked at this. We tested this question. In a way that I think gets you close to ideal here, and our trial did well. So what we wanted to do as an effectiveness obesity intervention for socioeconomic patients in Boston. What we wanted to do was to assume that patients wanted to interact with their intervention. Rather, what we wanted to do was to try to figure out something that would be broadly disseminable, broadly disseminable, and something that patients could choose to use in a variety of ways. And so what we did, we conducted this two-arm 24-hour trial, which in effect means that anybody is interested about attention to their levels of inflammation, the doc refers to took them have variable exclusion criteria. We did this with 365 obese patients with hypertension in Boston Health Center. And what you'll see here, and what I is critical about data like this, is that these are ones, in fact, the middle age, predominantly black population, did not graduate from high school. Many of whom had all of whom were impoverished, and most of them were insurance. Many of whom, because the study was conducted right in the midst of the economic crisis, became homeless. We had 30% of folks on this trial used at one point. Trials profoundly socioeconomic population. And so we didn't want to make any expectations about how we wanted to interact with the population. So we randomized folks to intervention and care, and the folks in the intervention arm got to choose between using to interact or using a combination of interactive voice response and print. And IVR, interactive voice response calls, you can think of these kind of jargon. These are calls you get on your telephone, interactive telephone, in order to self-monitor. Automated attendant may say, tell me how many times this week you got above feedback. And it's very similar interfaces. Just to fast forward to the end, what you saw in this trial was a moderate amount of weight loss that was sustained over 2 years in interventions, and reductions in systolic blood pressure over those 2 years. That's about almost a systolic blood pressure. But the real important thing here is asking, who were the people who decided to use the web? So we allowed them to choose whether they wanted to use the web or use this interactive voice response. And we allowed them to switch back and forth as they saw fit, in a way that mimics what's going on in social market. And the people who picked the web, even in this profoundly socioeconomically disadvantaged population, were the people who used that. They were the ones who had higher education, literacy, lived at a younger age, and the ones who had access to it. And what you see in terms of engagement, a pattern that looks like this, I showed this before a little bit differently, but you see folks logging in more than once a week and that decline to about weekly at closing. And that's about what we expected to see. We asked who were the people most likely to use it. Not choose it in this case, but most likely to use it, to log in, to track their goals. It was the same group of people, the folks who were somewhat more educated and the like. So this makes sense for people, even in a very socioeconomically disadvantaged population, folks who had access and folks who had more educational resources to take advantage of these technologies than those who did. We also had this IVR print arm that people could choose to elect to use. We had this kind of the print part of this was stickers, take the stickers off, log, and then you call, you get this call once a week from your log, how well you're doing, and logs on the right section. And this is what we saw in terms of interactive response. So, what happened was about 50% of participants call over. We asked the question, who were the folks who were more likely to use this IVR? They were the inverse of the former. They were somewhat less educated, had less regular internet access. But what's really important is that the interactive voice response folks were less likely to stop using versus the web. So one of the classic problems you have with the file, it's not that people drop out of it, they just stop using it. At some point along the way, they just stop using it. They'll come back for your evaluation visits in 2 years. They just stop using the technology. And what we find is that people inside the arm were less likely to stop using it. We found no correlates of IVR engagement, so there were no socio-demographic or psychosocial or behavioral predictors of who's more likely to use this IVR system. But importantly, again, remember, we allow people to switch back and forth. So just like you do with Facebook or any other type of social media app, we allowed them to stop using the web one day and start using the voice response the next, and met their needs. And interestingly, though, all the participants from any of the switching moved from the web to the IVR. No one moved from the phone. There were no predictors of switching status except for low engagement. So we looked at the whole range of psychosocial, behavioral, and demographic predictors to predict who's going to use it. The only thing that predicted that was whether or not they would have. And importantly, people who switched had the lowest likelihood of stopping. So one way of framing this is that if you give people options, and this is an example of the kinds of dissemination science, the kind of effectiveness work that we push this forward. Because one of the really important things in the conversations that we've been having with potential adopters is that people want a broad range of potential channels with which to interact with their When I was on the industry side, as Bonnie mentioned, along the way, I went to sabbatical and worked there and was put on the position of evaluating evidence, adopting evidence for dissemination in the industry. But one of the challenges we often had, I would go off and I'd call my friends. I know you adopted. That was really exciting because I was able to use evidence-based interventions to very sick people. But the challenge that we had was that many of us frequently designed for one thing, only designing for and what you find is that potential adopters want to know, and they want to know how. And those aren't data that we have. So I think a key priority for dissemination science is both increasing the likelihood of interventions, and one way of doing that is to ask this question: how do people use intervention on multiple channels? But it's also important that we use designs that match the needs of the market. And designs here, I mean quite broad. If I asked you which one of these apps was designed by a researcher, which one was designed by industry, I think most people would answer. I think Bonnie, you mentioned it at eHealth Summit, I think once, that we have a whole lot of ugly apps. That doesn't mean that they don't work. In fact, some of our ugliest apps work pretty well. I think you're right about that. But I'd argue we don't know how well they work. We don't know how well they are pretty much. And both of those are problems. So I do think that one issue is that realizing design really matters. Design matters a lot. Look, when I was learning how to do this stuff, mostly doing design doesn't matter that much. There's only so many permutations. But I can tell you that when you design a mobile web app, the placement of the button 2 pixels to the left and right dramatically impact the likelihood of permutations. And so one of the other challenges from a design perspective is that we don't buy software this way anymore. When was the last time any of you went to a software store and saw a display like this? This just doesn't happen very much. If it does, don't raise your hand. But this is the way we buy our apps these days. When you go online, you go to the App Store, you go to the iTunes Store, you buy your apps online through the cloud, and then every now and then you get this that says, hey, we've got a new version of it. You need to update your app. And one of the reasons that we've seen this movement towards apps that are continually updated is because we know that these changes make a big difference in how well people use technologies. For any of you who had iPhones, I bet you noticed that when you went from iOS 4 to iOS 5, so you know what that is, there was a 2-pixel change in the home icon space that Apple uses. And that was because people with big fingers weren't able to apply the square on. They just moved it. I'll tell you how much consumer research went into verifying that 2 pixels. But for Apple to do that across all of its devices means that design matters. There may be more fun ways of looking at this question of design. Some of you know that the Obama campaign, no politics here, but the Obama campaign is a cool example of the use of design because they randomized controlled trials in last year's election. In the developer market, it's called which means that you design 2 different iterations of this, one that's controlled and one that's an intervention. And you identify an outcome. In this case, the outcome was how many people hit that red button at the top that says get started. And their goal was to try to increase the number of people who simply hit that button. And what they find is that then they rolled out a website that looked like this. The only thing that, first of all, they're advertising dinner. This versus this one. And this image is, I guess you can imagine yourself. This is associated with a 19% increase in that web button. Think about this from a volume perspective. Literally tens and hundreds of millions of this website. 19%. Huge. Here's a more interesting one. This was a Obama campaign to continue to donate after you donate once. So if you donated once, what they then asked you to do is to save your credit card information. If you wanted to return, So they had to ask you to record, ask you for the credit card information to store. So this is the first way they did it. And you see the tagline there says, save your payment information. Next. This version says, now, save your payment information. This version was associated with 21% increase. They made $110 million. Design matters. It matters a lot. At changing the word, adding a comma, dramatically change. And yet, we have very little ways to appreciate this in design trials. In fact, this is just the way that commercial developers develop. I know this is very busy. What you see here is just those blue circles, right? It's code. And this is called the lean startup. This is the model that most of us adopt. And the basic idea here is then we code them, then we get and we change our ideas. It sounds a lot like science. It sounds a lot like what we do. And the point here is that they're continually evolving in the development of these inventions. And that leads me to this question, which is that is the engagement that we see in our industry, thinking about engagement from the perspective of the product or the process. What is it that draws a person back to time and time again? Is it all of the fancy features that we have? Or is it the fact that we continually update these things? And that every time I load up my laptop, I see there are different ready for my rails. I'm thinking, I'm going to go back in. And in fact, when you look at commercial data, what you find is that every time you see an uptick in utilization. And so we have no ability to do this. The constraints of the randomized controlled trial, again, when I randomize participants, I'm randomizing them to an intervention that I believe to be finished. And so if we were to compare what happened in my wall trial that I just talked about a minute ago to how this is done in a mobile weight loss app, which is very similar, called Weight Watcher Diary. It's around the it could be well released earlier, but Ultimate Weight Watcher Diary has only now been around just over, it was 2 years now. But if you just look at what's happened year of their release, this is the number of updates. You've got to believe that these updates means they're fixing bugs, they're adding this, they're adding new functions, they're doing a whole range of things that allow them to extend utilization of these apps. And I wasn't able to do that. Basically, all you had in my intervention was the first word. So this, to me, is the real challenge. We know that when our apps are continuously updated, we're responding to users' expectations, we're responding to their behaviors, responding to their feedback. What's novelty effect to do this work? But what we need are research designs that allow us to measure this. I know that you have volunteer districts we use for in our lab as well. And so what we're doing now is, since we know they're going to continue to update these things, we're doing a bit of a modification of the trial design to allow us to capture, to say a priori we continue to update these things. Because I don't necessarily believe our app is a product. I believe it's a process. I don't believe it's something that is finished, but I believe the process of fixing it to respond to how users is how you produce changes in how. And what we really need a research design to accommodate that. Those are few and far between, but most are ones that we want to talk more about that later. But let me just show you one of what happens here and one of the implications of this. So this is SHAPE, and SHAPE is a weight gain prevention trial that we have for socioeconomically disadvantaged women in primary care in North Carolina. And what we do for women is that they interact with an interactive voice response call. They get tailored materials and they get 12 coaching calls. And what we did, I just want to compare SHAPE to B50Well. They both used interactive voice response in a very similar way. So B50Well was conducted in 2006 to 2011. And we had weekly interactive voice response calls. We had variable response. So that means that when folks receive a call, we asked them, how many sugar-sweetened beverages did you have? And they had to tell us a number. And then we would say, how much effort did you make? And those calls lasted 4 to 5 minutes. But what we realized was that we weren't doing this. And so we wanted to make some changes to optimize participant engagement. So when SHAPE came on board, and that was 2009 through this current year, we also had weekly. We had the same questions, but we switched to dichotomous response option. We asked people, did you have more than X number of sugars? Yes or no? Did you reach your target? Yes or no? And these calls are now 2 to 3 minutes. And what we see are, I think, pretty dramatic differences in engagement. The B50 the first way we did it, to shape the second way we did it. And we have around 75% of those calls 12-month shape. Now, there is nothing, I can tell you that I probably could have that we made shape within the first month or two. They weren't things that took 4 years. And yet, because our trial designs don't allow us to adapt the intervention once it's been rolled out until very recently, I had to wait several more years for another R1 to be able to test this question. Make a very slight and what you see is that it has meaningful and measurable outcomes. This is the last thing I want to leave you with, and that is that we really need to think about the dissemination. For all of us that do intervention research, I think a major challenge for us is that we tend to think about dissemination homes. So this is just a basic social ecological model, and you see all the usual suspects here, communities, families, individuals, friends. And when we're designing our interventions, I think we're most often thinking about potential adopters. We're thinking about primary care systems adopting our apps, or healthcare organizations, especially practices. But when it comes to eHealth apps, these are not the usual suspects. These are not the folks I think we're most likely to adopt our intervention. Rather, health plans have become individual adopters. They have a whole different set of expectations. You see consumer health companies like Johnson & Johnson make major acquisitions in the space of, of course, disease management. That's not to mention Google's, the Microsofts, all of the EHRs and PHR vendors, startups, Nike. Nike is technology now. And I think that it's really incumbent upon us to be thinking about these adopters when we develop our apps, because these are the people who buy them. When I was in the industry, if a health plan wanted to adopt an app, they wouldn't do it themselves. They do it through the So one needed to think about the infrastructure that exists at the disease management level, think about developing these apps in a very robust way. And yet we know very little about these settings. We don't know what the adoption considerations are. We don't know what happens once they hit those settings. We don't know what the relevant outcomes are. Bonnie and I have been talking about the outcomes that matter in adoption or a company to adopt or intervention, quality of life, patient satisfaction, they weren't change in health outcomes were not necessarily primary in all cases. It was for some, but not for all. But if I wrote a grant and I said I there's different standards of evidence, but they're important for us to know about. The other challenge, of course, is that in the market, shaping the thinking about new behavior design, how to design these patterns, are people who do this for them. This is one of my favorite blog posts. This is written by a very space. And what he says sounds like a conversation actually. I had a conversation last night over years, some really enjoyable behavior change at building. And then he goes on to basically create a behavior change theory. I've been thinking about this, and I've come to this idea. Behavior change is behavior change. You can't change what you do without it. And now he's created a health app that's based on this. And I can tell you he's gotten a lot of traction. So the failure of us to kind of think about these questions of dissemination being at the table interacting with the industry means that the industry goes after folks who are thought leaders as well. As I can tell you, I can see the difference. And that was my reaction as well. And yet, we don't really have much demand in our market for evidence. And we don't really know how to get evidence into our commercial apps. And for those of you who find the whole idea of talking about industry apps a little icky and live your life, I agree with you. That's why I'm back here. And yet, we don't really have nonprofit dissemination. NIH has started to do this. They've got their action. All that disseminating. Have a real problem. So I think we need to start to think more about making these things. One approach would be to begin to use the kinds of systems that we already have. So, so one of the things that you see designing health trials, trying to reach a lot of people, a website, and just trying to reach people, is that you have high attrition. So eHealth trials work best when you're including people in kind of standard ways. Have inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. But if you just release an app out into the wind, people generally are a little loath to sign up and drop out pretty quickly. So what we know is that it's just not enough to put it up online. We need to target specific groups of people and you need to go where the users are. So one potential, perhaps non-commercial dissemination option is to start to embrace ecosystems. So ecosystems is a term that everybody thinks they can define, but I like this one. Online touchpoints where users congregate. But these are the kinds of systems that you guys know about. There are systems like Twitter, which allow you not only to send messages, but allow you to do a whole range of other tasks, because Twitter has developed a platform that allows you to integrate. And so one of my favorite eHealth tools is a tool that was designed by one of my postdocs, Sherry Pagato, has a strategy called Plank a Day. And what you do is that you sign up for Plank a Day. You say, every day I'm going to do a plank. And you go on Twitter and you say, I did my Plank a Day using the hashtag. And Sherry has written software that looks on Twitter and advises people who signed up for Plank. And she sees whether you've done your Plank. If you haven't done your Plank, the Plank a Day cop comes and basically excoriates you for not having a plank in front of all of the Twitters. And I've had adult influencers on my kids called up all of the time. My daughter planked a day yesterday. Sherry has thousands and thousands of people. Non-commercial dissemination options, change, you're having fun, totally non-commercial. Those where the users are, and she's having a measurement. So using these kinds of systems, I think, they allow us to not have to get design. You don't have to think much about this. But there are a whole range of ecosystems out in the commercial market. My favorites. Yeah, some Pinterest is wonderful. It's like an online. I use it. I like capturing all the pictures. My wife uses it to take pictures of houses that she lives in. And so you know, we use it and share it. And we just released a big trust. Great. So these are places like Facebook alone sends 60 million people each month. Third-party applications like and these are systems that are highly trafficked. They have development expense. They're very easy to develop for. But importantly, people stay on them. Just look on the right-hand side. The average month just for one hours. That is 6 hours each month on Facebook. And so this is where the users are. This is where they stay. I don't think we should be fighting it. We should be embracing it and it easier to use. But there's a whole new generation that are designed to be extensive. Many of our current systems are designed to be existing HR systems, not because I like HRs. I don't have horrible systems designed for them. But the question is, from an adoption perspective, and then the very, very final thing is using APIs. And this is for the nerds in the room. I will leave you with this. There's a fun business and the idea is that many of us have Intel and chips inside of our computers that stick on the Intel inside. And the notion of being the Intel inside is sort of saying, try to release an app, try to build sales and marketing. The secret sauce, make it easy for developers to use by releasing it. And so let me give you an example of what we're doing. We're using application programming. So for those of you who are not programmers, if you wanted to design a mobile app, this is what let's say you wanted to create a mobile app, or and the mobile app that you want to give your child a cell phone. And any time that your child is outside of a targeted zone, you get a telephone. Very simple app. The way you would do that is not by figuring out how to make the GPS inside the iPhone. Try to figure out how to make it. That's not how you approach it. Do from a programming perspective, is to write a program that says, if the phone goes outside, it's call. And then to make it work, what you do is you use APIs. So this first thing. So if my phone goes outside the zone, how do I know it's outside the zone? Well, I use what's called this application programming interface, which you can think of to the iPhone's existing GPS function. So we have all this make it very easy anytime. Do that by connecting. So you don't write all the code. GPS, Apple's already done it. then I want you to call a phone or make a text message. Well, there are all of these companies out there that use telephony APIs. So they make it easy for you to issue a telephone call or text. They handle all the telephone stuff and all the wireless stuff, all the issue and call stuff. All you do is tell this API, make a telephone call, call this number. And the API handles the rest. So we use a company called Twilio. We work very closely with them. And all we do is Twilio to in that way, a mobile device programmer doesn't need to know everything about everything. They just need to know how to put together these various pieces, cobble them together into a great do. And so we have a vision for APIs for evidence-based. So we have an underlying structure for all of our interventions. It's called IOTA. And IOTA works in a very simple way. It is that you gain weight when you take in more energy. And in order to expend more energy intake, a couple of things. One thing is to track calories, activity. The other thing is to change routine behavior. So we have algorithms that assess where a patient is on a given set of behaviors, and then cobbles together using algorithms, efficacy, barriers. We can tell the patient really what you need to do is to get 8,000 steps a day, have no sugary drinks, eat 5 fruits and vegetables, watch less than 2 hours. This is very face valid. It seems simple to you. That's good because I want to see some patients. But on the back end, I know that the average one is 5, 6, and 12 pounds. Those 4 goals are associated with something like 600 calorie deficit each day. So if she does that each day, then she'll have a caloric deficit sufficient to produce weight loss. Not a huge amount of weight loss, but it's enough to produce weight loss. That's IOTA. And that's what powers all of our interventions. So what we've done is that we've put IOTA into all of our goal questions, our scoring algorithms, feedback algorithms. So every day our patients are monitoring how well they're doing on this set of 4 goals. And we send them tailored feedback, for skills training, tailored based on a variety of parameters. All of that stuff we put behind an API. And we're going to let developers be developers. I'm not necessarily I'm a developer. Bad one. I don't think that our time is necessarily well spent investing in the development. But I think my time is pretty well spent developing, extending the disseminability of that special sauce. So app makers want to create a app going forward don't even think about how am I going to do that. They just use the and integrate it into apps. Most weight loss app developers are actually more interested in devices. So you have an app developer who wants to make a device, but they don't really want to make devices to think about calories. They can use AI and I can imagine the same thing with the same kind of space intervention. Let's make it easy to develop. That's what we're doing now. So let me close by just saying that I think we need to really focus on our value proposition. I don't think this market around is best. The dissemination is challenged by market forces. So I think we need to be focusing on what we're good at. One of those things is engagement, about how to increase that will have major benefits. We also need to use designs that allow us to mimic this and the design conventions of the market. Ultimately, that's where tools. And if we don't want to put in I'm 100% but that means that we're going to need non-commercial dissemination like the API systems out there. So let me stop there and I'll take any questions if you want to yell at me. Do it now or fine. That's very eloquently. There are a broad range of issues. No, it's remarkably succinct. It's a lot. I would say I'm supportive of RCT efficacy trials for the reason not because I want to demonstrate determining whether these apps do or not. And I think that for a lot of them, even for some of the reasonably innocuous weight loss apps, there are, I think, inherent constraints in traditional weight loss intervention that limit participants' exposure to dose. Right? They're weekly, they're group sessions, very often. I worry sometimes about what patients with anorectic cognitions, what will happen if weight loss app every day body. About 40% of folks report 14 apps. That's scary. So I actually think trials that do a good job at detecting harm for those kinds of things. So even though I am probably as vocal a supporter of RCT as anybody, I think there's some moving too quickly in the direction of problems like that. At the same time, I think the most scientific answer I can think of are the whole and continuous monitoring is one that I think it's become very exciting. Even actually since the eHealth there's a lot of traction in this space, a lot of folks getting together saying, let's pool our data, let's continue to monitor these things over time. I think that's a really important step. The other thing is that what I think is helpful is not necessarily consistent with what I think will be helpful actually will have no bearing on what happens in the market. So I think the thing I'm actually hearing from venture capitalists a lot is that they're saying we want evidence. And I'll say, what does that mean? And they'll say, well, we want some demonstration that this thing works. And I'll say, well, what does that mean? Right? You get caught in that loop. But let's say that you get to the point where you're talking about health outcomes. Really, what they want, they don't. And so I think that what you'll find, what I think we need to do at the scientific efficacy level is to think both about rigorous evaluations. I think and be thinking about advanced strategies for monitoring. I think that's but I think what's going to happen in the market is that you're going to see development systems that will allow developers to suggest themselves to apps and cost effective. I don't think that's happen. And just the last thing very quickly. So obsolescence, this is I like everybody else. I'm talking about the PALM-based trials, the PALM pilot-based trials that we've done. I'm on a shelf someplace. We've got all these devices years of work. I think that happens. That to me is another reason developing that being I can tell you, APIs have been around for 20 years. Will continue to be largely on the device for folks to adopt really large systems or really systems like that. But so I think when it's interesting to move disseminating, then you I think more rapidly into that kind of special, I call it special sauce, but you move into the solutions that are somewhat more. So they're comfortable. This is know that. That's why they do stop using their view on